had always loved the outdoors. From the time I was a kid, camping was a family tradition. My dad, mom, and I would pack up the car with tents, sleeping bags, coolers, and enough food to last a weekend in the woods, then drive to one of our favorite spots. As I grew older, I started venturing out alone, wanting to experience the peace and solitude of nature without anyone around. It was one of those rare occasions that led me to a camping spot deep in the woods, far away from the usual trailheads. I hadn't been out here before, but I'd heard about it from a friend who mentioned how quiet and remote it was, and that seemed like exactly what I was looking for. I arrived in the early afternoon, and the sun was still high in the sky, casting warm light through the thick canopy of trees. I parked my truck by a narrow trail, which I assumed would lead me to a spot by a creek. The sound of the water would be a nice touch to the otherwise still silence of the woods. I grabbed my gear, tent, stove, food, a few essentials, and started walking down the trail. The path was overgrown, with brambles brushing against my legs as I made my way through. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles, and the occasional bird call echoed in the distance. After a mile or so, the trail opened up to a small clearing, perfect for setting up camp. There was a soft, flat spot near the creek, and I immediately decided this would be my home for the night. I started unloading my gear, setting up the tent, and making sure everything was in place. The sound of the creek nearby was soothing, and for a while, everything felt right. I knew I would be alone, but that didn't bother me. There was something peaceful about being out in the wilderness by yourself. As I finished setting up, I decided to explore the area a little more. I wanted to make sure there were no surprises, no sudden drop-offs or hazards close by that I hadn't noticed. I walked along the creek, watching the water flow over smooth rocks. The forest around me felt thick and ancient, but not in a scary way. It was just untouched, I guess, like I was one of the few people to have set foot there in years. As I continued, I noticed a narrow path leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't much, just a slight indentation in the dirt, but it was enough to pique my curiosity. I followed it for a little while, but the path grew steeper, and the trees started to close in around me. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the forest itself was growing denser the further I went. I almost turned back, but something about it kept me going. Maybe it was the fact that no one had been here for a long time, and I had a feeling that I could find something interesting, something nobody else had discovered. The path twisted and turned, leading me to a small hill. I climbed to the top, and when I looked around, I realized I had gone further than I expected. The trees were so thick now that the light had grown dim, and the wind seemed to pick up, rustling the leaves above me. I hesitated. I didn't have much daylight left. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and it was starting to get chilly. I decided to head back to camp, but the path wasn't as easy to follow now that the light was fading. The trees were taller, and the underbrush was thicker. I had to push my way through, stumbling over roots and rocks, trying not to lose track of where I was. I finally made it back to the creek, but something felt different. The air was colder, and the once peaceful sound of the water now seemed louder, more urgent. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to my tent and cook some dinner. When I reached the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. My camp was exactly where I'd left it, but something felt off. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. The tent was still there, the gear was still piled up, and the firewood I'd collected earlier was still in a neat pile. But the feeling of being watched settled over me, creeping in like a cold chill. I looked around, my eyes scanning the surrounding woods, but all I could see were shadows in the trees. There was no movement, no sound. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. I was just jumpy from being out here alone. I was fine. But when I looked back at the creek, I saw something, a movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing just inside the tree line. For a split second, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved again. It was tall, human-shaped, but I couldn't make out any details. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, and I found myself slowly backing away toward the tent. There was no one else out here, I reminded myself. It had to be an animal, maybe a deer or something. But no, this thing was standing perfectly still. It wasn't moving like an animal. I grabbed a stick from the pile of firewood, holding it like a makeshift weapon. The figure didn't move. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but I couldn't bring myself to take my eyes off it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, before it finally turned and melted back into the trees, disappearing like a shadow. My body was shaking as I dropped the stick and ran to the tent, closing the flap behind me. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the sounds of the woods around me. The usual night noises, crickets, the rustle of leaves, seemed louder now, more pronounced. But that feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It hung over me, suffocating me with its intensity. The night was long and uncomfortable. Every noise, every creak of the trees made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. I tried to keep calm, telling myself I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. But that didn't explain the figure I had seen or what it had been. By morning, I was exhausted. The sun had barely risen, but I had decided to pack up and leave. The forest was no longer the peaceful escape it had been when I first arrived. It felt oppressive now, like it was hiding something I couldn't see. As I packed my things, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure again. But it was gone. I hiked back down the trail, faster this time, not wanting to stick around longer than I had to. The day was brighter, the woods less ominous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally reached my truck, I threw everything into the back and slammed the tailgate shut. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone or something standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just trees, and the creeping suspicion that I wasn't the only one who knew about that place in the woods. The night started off just like any other Cub Scout camping trip. We were in the backyard, the tent was up, and there was that feeling of excitement buzzing in the air. It wasn't like real camping, no woods, no hiking to some far-off destination, but it felt close enough for us kids. We were still a bit too young for real wilderness adventures, but this would do just fine. 3 of us were inside the tent, and we were talking about the usual things, what we'd be doing when we were older, the new comic book we'd each read, and, of course, how cool we thought our campout was. We were probably a bit too loud for a backyard campout, but who cared? It felt like we were miles away from home, even though I knew my mom and dad were just inside the house, probably watching TV. The sound of rustling outside the tent drew our attention. First, we just laughed it off. We assumed it was a raccoon or maybe a stray cat sniffing around. But then the noises came again. This time, they were different. They didn't sound like an animal. They sounded like someone was walking around the tent, not really sneaking, but walking with purpose. Heavy steps, maybe someone trying to mess with us. I had this odd sensation that something was off. You know that feeling when your skin prickles, but you can't quite place why? Yeah, that was me. I was starting to feel that something wasn't right, but I brushed it off. It was probably just one of the older kids from the neighborhood messing with us, right? Then the footsteps stopped. Absolute silence. We waited, listening. I strained my ears to hear anything. The silence dragged on, stretching far too long. Then, a thud. A heavy thud, like something had hit the ground. "What's that?" one of my friends whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling slightly. But before I could say anything else, there was a sudden crash, a loud metallic sound, and before I could process what had just happened, I saw it. A flash of silver, an axe, coming down on my friend's head. It wasn't just a cut or a bump. The impact was terrifying. The axe came down with force, right inside the tent, and I saw the shock on my friend's face as the blade hit him. He didn't scream, not at first. His eyes went wide with confusion and pain, and then blood. It started to run down his forehead in thick rivulets. His body stiffened, and he looked at us with a mix of horror and disbelief. I froze, couldn't even breathe. My heart slammed in my chest as I realized what had just happened. This wasn't some prank. Someone had just attacked my friend. "Get out of here!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, and I don't even know why I screamed or what I thought we were supposed to do. But I was terrified. My body was stuck, my legs shaking so badly that I couldn't move. There was another crash, and I heard a man's voice, muffled but clearly not sounding like a prank anymore. "Get out, you little brats." I had no idea what to do. I didn't know if I should run, if I should try to help, or if I should just hide. My mind was racing, but it wasn't processing anything fast enough. Then, the door of the tent was flung open, and I saw him, the man who had done this. He was one of the older kids from the neighborhood, someone who had been hanging around all day, making fun of us and joking about knocking our tents down in the middle of the night. But this wasn't just a prank anymore. This wasn't the kid who liked to play harmless jokes. This guy had a dangerous look in his eyes, and the sight of my friend lying motionless on the floor of the tent made everything feel more real than I had ever imagined. I heard the sound of shuffling footsteps moving away from the tent, and then silence again. It was like time stood still. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think. My body was still frozen in place, but I knew we had to get help. I reached for my friend, shaking him, trying to wake him up, but he didn't move. The blood kept flowing from his head, pooling around him like some kind of dark reminder of how fragile everything was. "Help! Somebody help!" I screamed, but no one answered. There was no one around. A few minutes later, though it felt like an eternity, the door to the tent flew open again, and this time it was my dad, standing there with a flashlight in his hand. He rushed over to my friend, and the beam of light illuminated the mess. His face went white when he saw the blood. I can't even remember how long it took for the ambulance to arrive, or how many people were there. I remember the paramedics talking in hushed voices, saying things I didn't understand. They said something about shock, about head injuries, and they kept telling us to stay calm. I remember the sirens wailing in the background, a distant noise that echoed in the pit of my stomach. The rest of us, me and my two friends, were taken inside the house. The night felt like it had stretched on forever. I can still remember sitting there in the living room, my eyes glued to the TV but not really seeing anything. My dad was pacing, and my mom tried to calm me down, offering cookies and hot chocolate. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. We never saw our friend again. The paramedics took him away that night, and I never heard from him after that. His family moved away not long after the incident. We never even got to say goodbye. That night, I was shaken to the core. I don't think I slept for days after that, and it made me question everything about camping. The excitement, the fun, the stories we told ourselves about brave adventures in the woods. All of it seemed hollow, like some false sense of security we had built up around ourselves. I don't think I would have ever camped again if it hadn't been for my brother. He was an Eagle Scout by that point, full of tales about the outdoors, survival skills, and the things he had learned on his own camping trips. He made it sound so easy, so fun. I started going on more camping trips, slowly, cautiously, trying to get over the feeling that something terrible would happen again. But even as I grew older, even as I got more comfortable with the idea of camping, the memory of that night always lingered in the back of my mind. And then came my teenage years. By then, I was still camping, still going on trips, but the excitement had worn off. It wasn't the same for me anymore. I was always more cautious, always more aware of the dangers around me. Couldn't help it. One night, I came back early from a camping trip. It was well past midnight when I got home, and the house was dark. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I walked into the living room, I startled my dad, who had been sitting on the couch with a gun in his hand. He had been reading one of those gun manuals he was so obsessed with. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice sharp and fearful. His hand was on the trigger, and I could see the panic in his eyes. For a split second, I thought he was going to shoot me, thinking I was an intruder. "Dad, it's me," I said, holding up my hands to show I wasn't a threat. My heart was racing. My mom stepped in then, sensing the danger. She quickly walked over to Dad and lowered his hand, making him realize that it was just me. I've never been so grateful for her calmness in a situation like that. I think that night scared me more than any camping trip had. There were other close calls as I got older, but they were nothing like the first one. Nothing like the night my friend was attacked, the night the backyard camping trip turned into a nightmare. I still think about him sometimes, wonder where he is, if he's okay, if he ever recovered. But the truth is, I don't know. I never saw him again, and it's been years. Camping for me after that was never the same. I went on other trips, had other adventures, but the weight of that night stayed with me. Couldn't shake it. Maybe that's why I started taking everything more seriously, why I started thinking more about the risks, the things that could go wrong. But even then, I couldn't stop the nagging feeling that sometimes things could get too real, too fast. That night, in the backyard, was a reminder that camping isn't just about fun. It's about survival. And sometimes, survival isn't as easy as just walking away from the bad stuff. Sometimes, it's something you can't escape. The wind had been howling all day. It was the first day of our 150-mile canoe trip down the Yukon River, starting from the south end of Lake LaBerge. We had been paddling for hours, trying to stay on track, but the constant gusts kept pushing us off course, making every stroke feel like we were fighting a battle just to stay in place. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but there was no turning back now. We had planned this trip for months, and there was no way we were going to give up on the first day. Lake LaBerge stretches out like an endless mirror of water and sky, the shoreline a jagged blur on the horizon. The canoe was heavy, loaded down with all our gear, tents, food, water, and the essentials we would need for the next 5 days. Each stroke of the paddle felt harder than the last, and the wind kept shoving us sideways, making it almost impossible to keep a straight course. We were way behind schedule. By the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, we had only covered a small fraction of the distance we had planned. The lake was still roaring with gusts, waves splashing over the sides of the canoe. We kept our course as best as we could, but it wasn't going to be enough. We would have to find a place to camp soon, even though we hadn't made the distance we needed to. The wind kept us from making much headway, and we realized the truth. If we didn't make it to shore soon, we were going to be stuck on the water after dark. The first night was spent huddled by a small campfire, trying to stay warm and dry as the wind howled through the trees. We set up our tents quickly, making sure we were far enough from the water in case the waves started to rise even more during the night. The Yukon River and its vast, untamed wilderness had a way of reminding you that it was in charge, not you. It was humbling. The next morning, we woke to the same relentless wind. It had been an awful night of restlessness, the storm not easing off until early morning. We packed up quickly, eager to make up for lost time, but the wind didn't let up. It was even stronger than before. Every stroke felt like we were paddling through molasses, and we could see the shoreline drifting away from us instead of getting closer. Around noon, the wind suddenly died down. The water, which had been churning with waves, turned to glass smooth, almost eerie in its stillness. It was like the whole world had paused for a moment, and the sudden calm was almost as unnerving as the wind had been. We knew we had to take advantage of the stillness, so we picked up speed. Our plan was to cut between some peninsulas and make up the time we had lost the day before. It seemed like a good idea at the time, shortcutting a portion of the lake and avoiding the long, curved shorelines that we had spent hours trying to navigate through. We paddled with more enthusiasm now that the water was so calm. The temperature was perfect, not too cold but just chilly enough to remind us that we were still in the wilderness. We passed a few quiet bays, the occasional bird flitting across the water, but nothing else seemed to stir. The air was peaceful, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe that we had it under control. Then, just as quickly as the calm had come, it vanished. We were about halfway across the stretch between two peninsulas, more than a half-mile from shore, when the sky started to change. It wasn't gradual. One moment, the sky was bright and clear, and the next, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, swirling in a way I'd never seen before. It looked like a storm was coming, and fast. There was no time to turn back. We'd gone too far out to make it back to shore in time, and the storm came in quicker than I could have imagined. The wind picked up first, a sharp gust that sent waves crashing against the side of the canoe. We had no choice but to turn the boat into the waves to prevent it from capsizing. The water was choppy now, the kind of waves that made your stomach flip every time they hit. They were 2 to 3 feet high, pushing us in every direction, but mostly towards the middle of the lake. The water started to swell, and I could hear the roar of the wind as it howled through the trees. But now it wasn't just wind. It was something worse, something more violent. The thunder cracked, and the sky lit up with flashes of lightning. It was chaos. We paddled harder than I had ever paddled in my life, just trying to stay in one spot, trying to keep the canoe from getting pushed any further into the storm. The canoe bobbed in the waves, and the spray of water hit my face, but I kept going, paddling with everything I had. Every stroke felt like it was only keeping us from getting swept away, not moving us forward at all. I could feel my muscles burning with exhaustion, but there was no room for hesitation, no room for fear. We just had to keep going. The storm intensified. The sky went from dark to pitch black, and we were left with nothing but the flashing light of the lightning to see. The wind screamed, pushing the canoe sideways. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the shore, but it was impossible to tell where it was. All I could see was the storm and the waves, growing bigger by the minute. I don't know how long it went on. It felt like hours, though it was probably only 45 minutes. The storm was relentless. Each time I looked ahead, I saw nothing but the walls of water crashing towards us. My arms were aching. My hands were raw from gripping the paddle so hard, but there was no choice but to keep fighting. I could feel my heart racing, the panic bubbling up as the storm raged around us. My mind kept telling me that if we capsized, we'd freeze to death in the cold water. I didn't want to think about it. Couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wind started to let up. It wasn't sudden, but the gusts slowed down enough that we could finally make some progress. The waves began to settle, though they still tossed the canoe up and down. It wasn't calm yet, but it was enough to make a move towards shore. We paddled hard again, pushing through the last of the storm. The shoreline was still a distant blur, but it was there. With each stroke, we got closer, and I could feel the panic start to subside. We weren't out of the woods yet, but we were no longer in the middle of a violent storm on an endless lake. By the time we reached the shore, the storm had passed, leaving only the remnants of its fury. Wet, broken trees and a sky that was still dark and threatening. But we had made it. We didn't capsize. We didn't freeze to death. We had survived. We pulled the canoe up onto the shore, breathless and exhausted. The wind had died down completely, leaving the air eerily still, like the world was holding its breath. We found a place to camp, setting up an improvised shelter to keep out of the cold, but our minds were still racing from the storm. That night, as we sat in our shelter, huddled together, the full weight of what had happened started to sink in. We had faced a storm that could have easily claimed our lives, and we had made it through. It felt like a miracle, but it was also a reminder of how fragile our grip on survival really was in the wilderness. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and everything could have gone wrong. But we made it, and as I lay there, listening to the wind dying down and the rain tapping lightly on our shelter, I knew I would never forget the terrifying 45 minutes in the middle of that lake. It was the scariest moment of my life, but it was also one of the most exhilarating. It reminded me that no matter how prepared you think you are, the wilderness can always throw something at you that will test everything you've got. But as long as you keep paddling, as long as you keep fighting, you can make it through. And we did. I worked in Yellowstone National Park during the summer of 2011 and again from spring to fall of 2013. It was the kind of job that surrounded me with stunning natural beauty, but also constant reminders of the dangers that lurk in the wild. When I met my girlfriend in 2013, we decided to take a trip to Cook City. It seemed like a nice spot for a camping trip after my shifts in the park, especially since we hadn't had a chance to spend much time alone together with my unpredictable schedule. It was the summer, and the air was warm, though the sun had already begun its descent as we pulled into Cook City. We stopped at a little local diner for dinner, and after a good meal, we talked to the waiter about the area. I had heard whispers about a bear attack that happened a couple of years earlier, something that had stuck with me from my time working in the park. I asked the waiter if it was true. He didn't hesitate, confirming that yes, the attack happened at the campground we were staying at, and it was bad, 3 people, 1 fatality. The waiter didn't go into much detail, but simply gave us a look that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was clear that he didn't think it was a coincidence. I didn't want to spoil the mood for my girlfriend, so I kept the conversation light and focused on the scenery, but I couldn't help but feel uneasy as we drove to the campground. Even though it was in the middle of nowhere, it still felt off, like something was lurking just beyond the trees, watching. By the time we got to our tent, the sun was nearly gone, leaving a thin sliver of light along the horizon. I set up our campsite while my girlfriend unpacked. We both made sure the bear spray was within arm's reach, and I grabbed her softball bat, placing it next to me in case anything went wrong. I'd never felt so close to the edge of fear as I did that night. The idea of a bear attack lingering in my mind made me paranoid, no matter how many times I reassured myself that the chances of it happening again were low. That night, as we crawled into our sleeping bags, the forest around us was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional distant animal call. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I was trying to get comfortable, but the weight of the silence outside the tent felt suffocating. There was nothing but the faint rustle of the wind in the trees, the kind of quiet that makes you question whether you're truly alone. At some point, I woke up. My bladder was full, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I lay there for a while, my heart racing as I tried to work up the courage to leave the warmth of the sleeping bag and venture out into the dark, cold night. The night was thick with the smell of pine, and I could hear the stream flowing nearby. Suddenly, there was a loud, unmistakable sound that froze me in place. It was the unmistakable noise of something crossing the stream. I could hear the splashes clearly, one after another. My senses immediately heightened. I could feel my pulse quicken, and my body became flooded with adrenaline. My hands, which had been cold and clammy, suddenly felt like they were on fire as I slowly reached for the bear spray next to my girlfriend. The tent fabric felt like it was closing in on me, and every sound around us felt magnified. The animal continued to move closer, its steps heavy and deliberate, clomping through the brush and over the rocks by the stream. It was the kind of sound that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I looked over at my girlfriend. She was still asleep, unaware of what was happening. I gently shook her, waking her up, and as her eyes fluttered open, I whispered urgently, "Stay quiet. Don't make a sound." She froze, her eyes widening as she heard the noise too. The steps continued around our tent, and then a strange sound broke the rhythm of the footsteps. A dull thud, like something being dropped. Another thud followed. My heart was in my throat now. I could feel the tension in my body, the fight or flight response kicking into overdrive. I carefully unzipped the fly of the tent just enough to peek outside, trying to make as little noise as possible. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie silver light over the campsite. I squinted through the opening, trying to make sense of the shapes outside. At first, all I could make out were dark shadows, and then I saw them, 2 large, dark shapes in the moonlight. One of them was much bigger, and I could tell by the way it moved that it was a bull elk. The other was a doe, smaller and standing nearby, grazing on the grass. But what struck me as odd was what the bull elk was doing. It was picking up rocks, huge, heavy rocks, and dropping them over and over again with a strange rhythmic motion. It was like a game to the elk, picking them up and letting them fall again. The sound of the rocks hitting the ground was deafening in the silence of the night. The thud echoed through the stillness, and I couldn't understand why it was doing this. I watched in stunned silence, my fear momentarily forgotten as I tried to process what I was witnessing. The elk was too close for comfort, and I knew better than to think it was harmless. Elk can be unpredictable, especially when they feel threatened or cornered. But in that moment, the weirdness of the scene took over my mind. I wasn't scared of the elk, not at first at least, but I still felt exposed, vulnerable. After what felt like an eternity, the bull elk dropped one final rock and seemed to lose interest in the area. It and the doe slowly wandered off into the darkness. My body was still tense, my heart still pounding in my chest, but I felt a wave of relief wash over me as the creatures disappeared into the night. My girlfriend and I stayed completely still for a long time, listening for any signs of movement, but there was nothing. We didn't talk much after that. We lay back down in our sleeping bags, the adrenaline still buzzing in my system. But now I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at what we had witnessed. It had been one of the coolest things I'd ever seen in the wild, but it was also the scariest. There's something unnerving about being in a place so far from civilization, surrounded by creatures that can be as dangerous as they are beautiful. The rest of the night was uneventful. I eventually drifted off to sleep, but the fear that had gripped me earlier never fully let go. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were things out there, things we couldn't see, that were watching us. The next morning, the sky was clear and bright, but the weight of the night before lingered. We packed up our gear and headed back to Cook City. The whole time, I kept thinking about the bear attack I'd heard about years ago. Even though the elk had been harmless, that fact didn't change the reality that we were camping in a place that had seen real danger just a few years prior. As we packed up, I couldn't help but think of the dangers that are always present when you're camping in grizzly country. It wasn't the elk or the doe that worried me. It was the invisible things, the things we couldn't see but knew were there, lurking in the shadows. The animals that don't make their presence known until it's too late. That day, I was reminded once again of the raw power of nature, the way it can be both beautiful and terrifying. The quiet moments in the wilderness are often the most intense, not because of what you see, but because of what you know is out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. The roar of lions was the first sound that pierced through the darkness of the early morning. It came from somewhere close by, so close it made my heart skip a beat. The sound of the king of the jungle announcing his presence. The growls echoed through the air, reverberating in my chest. At that moment, I was wide awake. There is nothing that hits the primitive part of your brain like the sound of a lion's roar when you're in a tent with nothing but a thin piece of fabric between you and the wild. The sound was followed by an answering call of elephants, deep and rumbling, rolling across the savanna. A perfect symphony of Africa's wild side. I froze for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Then instinct kicked in. I was in Tsavo National Park, one of the wildest places on Earth. It was an area famous for its lions and the drama of its wildlife. My tracker and guide, who had warned me this could happen, was already up. The fire was crackling, the flames dancing. As he added more fuel to it, the smell of burning would mixing with the crisp morning air. I slipped out of my sleeping bag, pulled on my boots, and zipped open the tent door slowly, making sure not to let any of the cold night air inside. I stepped out, feeling the slight chill on my skin as I walked to the fire. The flames illuminated the surroundings in an eerie glow, casting long shadows on the dry, cracked earth. The camp was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of wildlife. The stars were still out, twinkling in the dark sky above us, and the first hint of dawn was beginning to break on the horizon. I could see my guide, his face illuminated by the firelight, already sitting by the flames with a calm, focused look. He barely seemed disturbed by the roaring lions in the distance, but I could see the way he kept his eyes darting around, alert to any changes in the air. The fire would keep the predators at bay, he had assured me, but no one really knew how close those lions were. That uncertainty was something you learned to live with, and it was a very real part of being in the wild. It wasn't long before I noticed something odd. A slight movement at the edge of the camp. A tent, not far from ours, started to shift, the fabric rustling as if something inside was moving. I watched closely, trying to figure out what was going on. Then, with a sudden jolt, the tent zipper was yanked open, and a man emerged, stumbling out of the tent like he was being chased by something. Without a second thought, he bolted across the campsite, running flat out toward his Land Rover, which was parked about 50 feet away from his tent. His movements were frantic, almost like he was being pursued. I couldn't help but chuckle quietly to myself. It seemed absurd. Here I was, on the edge of the wild, surrounded by the sounds of lions and elephants, and this guy was running like a madman. I wondered if he had dreamed he was being attacked or had somehow heard a lion nearby and panicked. The man made it to his Land Rover, jumped inside, and slammed the door behind him, breathing heavily. I couldn't see his face, but from his frantic movements, I figured he was probably trying to calm himself. The lion's roars were still echoing in the distance, but they didn't seem to be getting closer. The guide just glanced at the man, as if this was an everyday occurrence. He didn't even seem fazed by it. "He's scared," the guide said quietly. "They all get scared out here at night. It's only natural." I stayed by the fire for a while longer, watching the orange and yellow flames flicker, the warmth creeping into my skin. The sounds of the wild, both frightening and beautiful, filled the air. Eventually, I retreated back into my tent, my mind still buzzing with the strange image of the man running like that. But I knew he'd be fine in the morning, just like me. The fire would keep the lions at bay. The next morning, as I unzipped the tent to see the first light of day, I stepped out and stretched. The world was quieter now, the wild sounds of the night giving way to the more gentle calls of birds and the occasional rustle of the wind. I glanced over to the area where the man had been. His Land Rover was still there, parked as he had left it. But as I looked around the camp, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. I walked a little farther to the edge of the campsite, and I saw the telltale signs of lion tracks in the dirt, fresh and large. They were everywhere. I counted more than 35 lions in a pride that had clearly passed through during the night, not far from where I had been lying in my tent. Later, I found out that the man had been a part of a small group, all traveling together through Tsevo. They had been camping a little farther away from the main site, where the lions had evidently passed through. The tracker told me the lions often moved through this part of the park at night, searching for prey, but this time they hadn't attacked. They had simply passed by. It wasn't the first time someone had been startled by their presence, though. The fact that the man had reacted so dramatically was not as unusual as I had thought. There's nothing quite like the feeling of being surrounded by wildlife in a place like Tsevo, especially when you're alone, but it's a different kind of fear than what I felt later in my life. That morning, I found myself thinking about how people react when they feel vulnerable. It made me think about a different experience, one I had on the rugged cliffs of Northern California a few years before. I had driven out to a remote beach, somewhere along the coast, far from any town or cell service. The place was secluded, just a few miles over the headlands, with cliffs overlooking the crashing waves below. It was one of those places that felt like it belonged to another time. As I set up camp near the cliffs, the beauty of the place struck me. The ocean roared beneath me, its waves crashing against the rocks. The sky was huge, the air briny and cool, and I felt like I was the only one alive in the whole world. I hadn't seen a soul in hours, no one around for miles. It was beautiful, but there was an odd feeling in the air. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe it was just me being on edge. I had grown up on the coast just north of San Francisco, so I was familiar with these remote places, but something about this spot felt off. I passed a couple on my hike in, a man and woman, and we exchanged a brief hello. Nothing unusual about them. They looked like they were going to set up camp, maybe hike around a bit. Nothing strange. It was just two people hiking in, no different from what I was doing. That night, I settled into my tent, listening to the waves and the wind. It was cold, but in the silence of the night, everything seemed to grow sharper. I felt a twinge of anxiety, the kind that comes from being so isolated. There was no one around for miles, no lights on the horizon. I thought about the couple I had passed earlier and wondered if they were camping nearby. The next morning, I packed up my gear and started heading back to my car, thinking about how peaceful the night had been despite my uneasy feelings. When I got back, I saw a single car parked in the pullout, but nothing else was around. I didn't think much of it and started my drive back to civilization. Then, a week later, I heard the news. 2 hikers, a couple, had been found dead on that same beach. They were decapitated in their tent. The location where it had happened was exactly where I had set up my own camp. The same cliffs, the same view of the ocean. The news didn't say much about who did it, and they never found the killer. The thought of those two people being killed so close to where I had been camping was enough to make my skin crawl. I don't know if it was the couple I had passed on the trail or someone else, but I could never shake that eerie feeling. The isolation of the place, the strange vibes I had felt, the fact that it had been so quiet. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened. I couldn't get the image of those poor hikers out of my head, imagining their final moments in that same camp. The police never caught anyone, and the case remained unsolved. It was the scariest camping experience I had ever had, not because of the wild, but because of the darkness that lies in the hearts of some people. The same darkness that might have been creeping up on those hikers when I passed them on the trail. The real fear comes from the unknown, and sometimes the scariest thing is not the lions in the night or the crashing waves, but what we can't see and can't control. What happened to that couple was a stark reminder of how even in the most beautiful, peaceful places, there can be darkness lurking just out of sight. It was the early 80s, and I was just a high school kid, excited and a little nervous for what was about to be a week-long backpacking trip through Yosemite. It was the kind of trip that seemed like an adventure at the time, but looking back, I realize how naive we all were. My classmates and I were on a school-organized trip, and this was my first real experience in the wilderness. The weather had been beautiful when we started, the crisp morning air of early summer filling our lungs as we set off from the trailhead. Our group was a mix of experienced hikers and total newbies, and honestly, I was somewhere in between. I had been camping before, but only in the backyards of my friends' houses or at campgrounds where other people were nearby. This was different. This was the wilderness, and there was no one else around. Our group had been hiking for a couple of days when we started noticing signs that we weren't the only ones in the area. Specifically, a group of campers on horseback. They must have been ahead of us by a day or two because we started to notice their campsites. At first, it was just a little bit of litter here and there, a candy wrapper, a half-eaten granola bar. But as we got closer to their campsites, the situation became worse. One campsite in particular caught our attention. It was an absolute mess. There was garbage scattered everywhere. Empty cans of tuna, plastic bags caught in trees, and what looked like fish entrails just tossed into the bushes without any regard for the environment. The smell of old fish waste lingered in the air, and it was clear these campers had no respect for the natural beauty of the area. It was frustrating, to say the least, and we couldn't believe people could be so careless. We didn't know it at the time, but the horse campers had also left behind something else, something much more dangerous. As we approached another campsite, we found their campfire still smoldering in the middle of the area. It had burned down to the edges of the fire ring, and the dry duff around it was starting to catch. The last thing we wanted was for that fire to spread out of control, especially in a place like Yosemite, where fire safety was taken very seriously. Without even thinking twice, our group immediately dropped our heavy packs and grabbed every available water bottle and canteen. A few of us ran down to the nearby creek to fill up, and we started dumping the water on the edges of the fire, making sure it wouldn't get any worse. It was a chore and everyone was working fast, but I still felt a sense of pride, like we were doing the right thing, cleaning up someone else's mess. But then, just as I was about to dump the last bit of water, I heard something behind me, something that made my heart skip a beat. It was quiet, too quiet, and I froze. The sound came again, and this time I could tell it wasn't a bird, a squirrel, or anything else that normally lived in the woods. It was heavier and it was closer. I turned around slowly, and there, just a few feet away, stood a bear. I didn't even have time to think before the bear darted toward me, its large, dark form moving faster than I could comprehend. It wasn't even like a wild animal attack you see in movies. It wasn't growling or making any noise. It just moved quickly, purposefully, straight for my backpack. I don't know why it went for my pack. Maybe it smelled the food. Maybe it was just curious. But before I could react, the bear grabbed it with its teeth and started running. My stomach dropped, and panic hit me like a wave. All I could do was stare for a split second, completely paralyzed, as it ran off with my gear. It all happened so fast. The next thing I knew, I was sprinting after it without even thinking. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, my breath ragged and fast. The others in our group were still trying to put out the fire when the bear bolted off with my pack, and I could hear their shouts as they turned to run after me. The bear, surprisingly fast on its feet, dodged between two small trees, and that's when I thought I might actually get my backpack back. But then I heard the snap of my pack's frame as it tried to push through the narrow gap, and I knew it was no longer in one piece. I was running as fast as I could, but I could see the bear was already way ahead of me, darting between the trees with my pack. I was determined not to let it get away with my stuff, but the distance between us was growing. I could hear the crashing of branches behind me, and then I saw it. The bear had gotten caught. The pack didn't fit between the trees the bear had chosen, and it had stopped to try and free it. It was a strange moment. Relief flooded me, mixed with fear, because I wasn't sure if the bear would turn on us next. I reached the spot where the bear had stopped. My pack was in pieces, the frame bent and the main pocket torn wide open. I could see the bags of trail mix and granola spilling out of the torn fabric, the bags shredded by the bear's teeth. My lunches I had been looking forward to for days, were gone, along with everything else I had packed. My first instinct was to grab the remnants of my pack and run, and so I did. I didn't even look back. We ran, all of us, for what felt like forever. My legs burned with exhaustion, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I don't know how far we went, but it felt like at least a mile, maybe more. The whole time, I was terrified that the bear would turn around and come after us, that we'd be too slow, too out of shape to escape. My mind kept racing, imagining what would happen if we didn't outrun it. Eventually, we came to a clearing where we stopped, panting, hearts pounding, barely able to stand from the sheer effort of it all. I was shaking. My legs were wobbly, and I couldn't stop my hands from trembling. But I was alive. I had survived the encounter, and for that, I was grateful. We took a few minutes to catch our breath and check each other over. No one was hurt, thank God. We all had that one moment when we realized how close we had come to something far worse. The bear had been so close, and if it hadn't gotten caught between those trees, I don't know what would have happened. We ended up moving on a little further after that, setting up camp in a new spot far from where the bear had taken my pack. The whole ordeal had taken so much out of us, but we still had a long way to go. The rest of the hike was quiet, but the air felt heavy with the memory of what had happened. The wilderness had reminded us that, despite how beautiful it was also unpredictable. We had all taken the bear's warning seriously, and we knew we wouldn't make the same mistake again. Our attention to safety, to food storage, and to everything else was heightened. Looking back, it was one of the scariest experiences of my life, but it also taught me a lesson I would carry with me forever: how fragile our place in the wild truly is, and how quickly everything can change when we least expect it. The bear didn't want to hurt us. It was just looking for food. But in that moment, everything felt so much bigger than just the bear. It felt like a reminder of how small we are, even in places as majestic as Yosemite. And for the rest of the trip, that reminder stayed with me, like a shadow, a constant awareness that the wilderness demands respect, and it doesn't give second chances. It was the last summer my mom took us camping, and I must have been about 11 years old. I remember it so clearly because it was the scariest thing I've ever experienced in all my years of camping. The storm that rolled in that night changed everything. It wasn't just another thunderstorm that we'd gotten used to, where we'd hide under a tarp or in the camper, waiting for it to blow over. No, this one was different, and we had no idea what was coming. We were camping in a truck bed camper, one of those old ones with metal legs that you could slide out of the truck bed to give you more space. It wasn't the most stable thing in the world, but we didn't have much choice. The truck had just enough space to haul everything, and it had been my mom's idea to try this style of camping for something different. The whole camper was just sitting on those metal legs, like an island in the middle of a campground. I don't think I realized it at the time, but that setup would come to be the thing I feared the most later that night. It all started around 2 a.m. The wind had been picking up for a while, but nothing too alarming. We were used to it when we camped. My mom always said that a little wind was just part of the experience, but this was different. The wind howled like a freight train in the distance, growing louder with each passing minute, until it started shaking the walls of the camper. The first time I woke up, I could hear the sound of rain, but it was more like it was pounding against the camper, almost as if the storm were trying to break through. It wasn't the usual rain against the windows that you could ignore and fall back asleep to. It was so much harder, so much more violent. I glanced over at my mom, who was sitting silently on the bed. She wasn't sleeping. She looked worried. Her face was pale in the dim light, and her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with that kind of intense focus you get when something feels seriously wrong. She wasn't looking out the window or anything, just staring ahead, listening to the storm. I don't know what exactly made me sit up, but I did. I didn't even need to say anything, but I whispered anyway, almost like I was trying to make sense of it out loud. "Tornado?" She nodded without a word, and we just sat there in the dark, listening. I could hear the wind slamming into the sides of the camper now, rattling it. The whole structure was shaking on those metal legs, creaking in protest like it was on the verge of giving up. It felt like the camper was going to tip over at any moment. The sound outside, it was like nothing I had ever heard before. It was that low, distant rumble you always hear about in tornado stories. But this was closer, so much closer. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, deep in my bones, like the earth was trembling. And then it was the sound of the train, a sound that's hard to describe unless you've heard it. That low, constant roar, like a freight train rushing through the woods. Only this wasn't a train. This was something much worse. For what felt like an eternity, we just sat there, both of us holding our breath, trying to hear over the noise. We didn't talk. There was no need to. My mom had been camping long enough to know what was happening, but even she couldn't hide the look of fear on her face. She knew that there was nothing we could do. All we could do was wait and pray that the storm would pass without hitting us directly. Then it hit. The wind was so strong, I could hear the metal of the camper groaning under the strain. It sounded like something was trying to lift it off the ground. The whole camper shook violently, and I could feel my stomach drop like I was falling, like the earth had just shifted beneath us. The rain started to pour in sheets, slamming against the sides of the camper so hard I thought the walls might buckle. There was nothing we could do. We couldn't even leave the camper because it would be worse out there, and the storm was too strong. All we could do was wait, and then the wind hit in a way that I'll never forget. It howled louder than it ever had before, and in the middle of that sound, I heard something else. A screech, a noise that wasn't just the wind. It was like something else was caught in it, like the earth itself was screaming. I remember squeezing my mom's hand so tightly, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We both knew. We were waiting for it to pass, but there was something about the way it felt, something about the way the world outside felt wrong, like something was out of control. Then, just like that, it was gone. The wind died down, the noise stopped, and all that was left was the rain. But the damage was done. My mom didn't say anything for a long while after the storm passed. She just looked out the small window, and I could see her shoulders slowly relaxing. But I could also tell that she was still scared. I had no idea how bad it had really been until I heard the first voices outside. The other campers were up and walking around, and some of them were talking in hushed tones. The sound of tires spinning in the mud made my heart skip a beat. My mom finally stood up and opened the door. I remember feeling the cold rush of air that came in. It was still wet, and the air smelled heavy with the storm's aftermath. I looked out into the campground, and that's when I saw it. The small trailers that had been nearby were now lying on their sides, twisted metal and broken glass scattered across the ground. Some of them had been completely overturned. But the worst part, the part I'll never forget, was seeing the Girl Scout camp. Their tents had been lifted right off the ground, like they were toys. I don't know if it was the force of the wind or the tornado's power, but those tents had been thrown into the air, almost like they weighed nothing at all. They were crumpled up on the ground, mangled and broken. The girls were huddled together in the campground bathroom, crying and shaking, some of them still in their pajamas. They looked like they'd just been through a nightmare. We made our way over to the group of scouts, and my mom talked to their leader for a few minutes. It wasn't the first time we'd seen the aftermath of a storm, but it was definitely the worst. The Girl Scouts had spent the rest of the night in that bathroom, and I don't blame them. The storm had knocked them off their feet, literally and figuratively. I don't know how long they stayed in there, but when they finally came out, they were pale and shaken, and a few of them still had that faraway look in their eyes. We ended up staying at the campground for a while longer, but we didn't feel like camping anymore. Not like we had before. Everything had changed. I could tell my mom was worried about something else. Maybe she was thinking about how close we came to being hit, or how fragile that little camper really was when you compared it to the sheer power of nature. The rest of the trip was quiet after that. We packed up early the next morning and left, heading home with the weight of the storm still heavy on us. That night was one I'll never forget. It was the kind of experience that makes you look at the world differently. You never realize how small and powerless you are until you're facing something like that. It's a humbling thing, and it taught me to never take nature for granted. I haven't been camping in a storm since, and I don't know if I ever will again. Some things are just too scary to face twice, and I'll always remember the sound of the wind, the scream of the earth, and the helpless feeling of sitting there in the dark, waiting for it all to end.